They say hindsight is 20/20, but in my case, it was more like 20/twisted. Because I had all the signs, the strange absences, the financial evasiveness, the distant eyes even when his arms were wrapped around me, and I ignored them. I made excuses. I spun little fairy tales in my head to avoid the truth. And for a while, I lived in that carefully curated lie. My name is Amara DuPont Davis. At 31, I thought I had everything I'd ever dreamed of. I was married to Tobias Davis, a tall, charming, suit-and-tie man with an effortless laugh and the kind of charisma that made people stop and listen when he entered a room. Together, we lived in a lovely little duplex in the quiet suburb of Glendale, just outside Los Angeles. We'd spent 3 years saving for that house, years of skipped vacations, no-name brand cereals, DIY dinners instead of date nights. But it had been worth it. The house was a dream. Cream siding, pale blue shutters, a brick-lined walkway with lavender and rosemary bushes flanking the path. It even had a wraparound porch where we sipped coffee on lazy Sunday mornings. I'd filled it with love and design, my two passions. As an interior designer, I believed that every space had a soul, a personality waiting to be uncovered. Tobias used to joke that I could give a broom closet a makeover and sell it to the Queen of England. He was proud of me, or so I thought. We had routines. He made coffee every morning. I'd water the garden while he read stock reports on his iPad. We had a rescue dog, Poppy, a scruffy terrier mix with more personality than most humans I knew. On Saturdays, we went to the farmer's market. On Sundays, we cooked together while Miles Davis or Etta James played in the background. It was soft, slow, deliberate, the kind of life people envied on social media. But beneath the carefully arranged centerpieces and smiling couple selfies, something was rotting, quietly, invisibly. It started with late nights. "Big client," Tobias would say. "Can't miss this opportunity. If we land this deal, babe, we could take that trip to Santorini you've been dreaming about." I nodded, encouraged him. I wasn't the clingy type. I was independent, busy with clients, chasing deadlines. We gave each other space, and it worked until the space turned into a canyon. Soon, it wasn't just the late nights. It was the closed-off energy. The way he'd come home distracted, like he'd left pieces of himself elsewhere. He'd get irritated over small things, a forgotten grocery item, the TV volume being too loud, Poppy barking at the neighbor's cat. One night, I found him sitting in the dark on the back porch, sipping whiskey. "You okay?" I asked, stepping outside. "Just thinking," he said, his tone unreadable. "About what?" "Work, life, everything." I sat beside him and reached for his hand, but he didn't take mine. Instead, he stared out into the night and said, "Do you ever feel like everything could vanish in an instant?" I thought it was just stress. I thought my husband was overwhelmed by the pressures of adulthood, success, responsibility. But I had no idea what kind of storm was brewing behind those tired eyes. I wasn't trying to snoop. That's what I kept telling myself. I was looking for my passport, that was all. I had a client opportunity in Milan. A boutique hotel wanted a full interior redesign, and they were flying out shortlisted designers. I was thrilled. It was my biggest break yet. So I dug through the desk drawers in our shared office, looking for my passport folder. I found old bills, a stack of greeting cards, Tobias's business receipts, and then, tucked between a folder labeled Home Warranty and a half-used notepad, I found something that would flip my world upside down. It was a thick envelope, creased along the edges. On the front was our bank's logo, Goldfield Trust and Loan. Inside were several stapled documents with dense paragraphs of financial jargon. I skimmed the first page. My eyes darted to the bolded header. Refinance agreement, residential property. My heart skipped. At first, I assumed it was from the year we first bought the house, but the date was recent, just 3 months ago. Then I saw my name. Co-borrower, Amara DuPont Davis. And my signature. Only, I didn't sign it. It looked eerily like my signature, the same looping A, the same trailing S at the end. But something about it was wrong. sloppier, slightly off-kilter, like someone had practiced mimicking it. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. Why would Tobias refinance the house without telling me? Why was there no mention of this in any of our conversations? That night, I waited for him to come home. I didn't say anything at first. I watched him move through the kitchen, loosening his tie, opening the fridge, complaining about traffic. Normal things. Then, I placed the document on the table between us. "What's this?" I asked. He looked at it for half a second, then smiled. A calm, dismissive smile, too smooth. "Oh, that, just some bank paperwork, probably sent it by mistake. It has our address, our names, a new mortgage amount. It says it was signed and processed." He chuckled as if I were being ridiculous. "Must be a clerical error. You know how banks are." My voice wavered. "That's not my signature." He shrugged. "I'll call them tomorrow. Don't worry about it." But that night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed beside him, eyes wide open, heart pounding. And around 2:14 a.m., I heard him whispering on the phone in the hallway. "She doesn't know. Once it's done, we're in the clear." I didn't confront him. Not then. Because something deeper than anger settled into me. Fear. Fear that the man lying next to me in bed every night wasn't just lying to me, but building an entirely separate life without me. There's something terrifying about learning the person who shares your bed has built an entire universe of secrets right under your nose. After hearing Tobias whisper those words on the phone, "Once it's done, we're in the clear," something inside me shifted. A quiet but irreversible snapping of a thread I hadn't realized had been fraying. The next morning, while Tobias showered, I sat at my desk and pulled out my laptop. I wasn't sure what I was looking for exactly, but I knew I needed to dig. Every instinct told me that the refinance wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, calculated. I started by logging into our bank accounts. The joint checking account looked normal. The usual withdrawals, utilities, groceries, gas. But then I opened the savings account, the one we'd been growing for years to use as a rainy day fund or someday adopt a child, and froze. Balance, $71.34. My throat tightened. 6 months ago, it had over $35,000. I clicked through the transaction history, heart racing. The money hadn't just disappeared all at once. It had been bled out slowly, withdrawal after withdrawal, transfer after transfer, always to the same obscure account. VM Holdings. I searched the name online. The results were vague, no website, no contact info. Just a few vague mentions in dark financial forums. Private equity firm, unregulated lender, high risk, high return, shark rates. The more I read, the colder I felt. What the hell was Tobias involved in? That afternoon, I called Liana. She was my best friend, my ride or die since college. We'd seen each other through bad breakups, bad haircuts, and worse career phases. "You sound off," she said the moment she picked up. "I need to ask you something," I said, my voice brittle. "Have you noticed anything strange about Tobias lately? Anything at all?" There was a pause. "I didn't want to say anything," she said finally. "But yeah, he's been, I don't know, jumpy, vague. And remember that night at Zara's fundraiser? He told me he was closing some big hedge fund deal, but when I asked what kind, he changed the subject." "Liana," I whispered, "I think he forged my signature on a refinance contract." Another pause. "Amara, that's a felony." "I know. What are you going to do?" I didn't have an answer. Not yet. That night, I didn't confront him. I couldn't. I needed more information, more proof. I was beginning to understand that I wasn't just dealing with a lying husband. I was dealing with a man who had risked our home and my name without blinking. I started looking through our filing cabinet, quietly, methodically. That's when I found the letter. It was from a man named Victor Mercier, printed on heavy paper with an embossed gold seal. It was formal, threatening. As discussed, repayment for the investment must be made within 90 days. Failure to comply will result in immediate foreclosure action on the asset listed in Clause 4.2. I skimmed to Clause 4.2. Primary asset, 42 Evergreen Lane. Our home. I felt like the floor dropped out from under me. Tobias had used our house as collateral, not just in theory, in a legal agreement. And he hadn't told me. He'd faked my signature. He had tied my life, my stability, my career, my credit, my name, to a man I didn't even know, for a deal I never agreed to. When Tobias came home, I asked him calmly, "What's VM Holdings?" He didn't flinch. "It's just an investment vehicle, nothing you need to worry about." "And Victor Murcia?" He hesitated. "A private investor, look, Amara. You used our house as collateral." He sighed and rubbed his temples like I was the problem. "I had to. There were time-sensitive opportunities. You don't understand how fast this stuff moves." "You forged my signature, Tobias." He finally looked at me, and his face changed, not into remorse but into frustration. "You're making this a bigger deal than it is." "A bigger deal," my voice cracked. "You stole our future. You gambled with everything we built. And now, if this deal falls apart..." "It won't. We lose the house." "I'll fix it," he said. "You keep saying that, but you haven't fixed anything. You've lied over and over. And for what?" He stood up, his voice cold and hard now. "You've always been so obsessed with control, Amara. Your routines, your budget plans, your home design boards. Everything has to be perfect. Maybe if you trusted me more, I wouldn't have had to go behind your back." I stared at him, stunned. "You're blaming me for your crimes." "Crimes?" He laughed bitterly. "You think I'm some kind of criminal. You forged a federal document." He didn't respond. And in that silence, I realized something. He didn't feel guilty. He didn't feel sorry. He felt cornered. A week later, the bank called. A man named Greg from the foreclosure department left a voicemail on my phone. His tone was polite, almost cheerful, as if telling me my life was on fire was just another line on his checklist. "Hi, Mrs. DuPont Davis. Just following up regarding the missed payments on the refinanced loan for 42 Evergreen Lane. As of this week, the account is officially in default. We'd like to discuss options before proceeding with formal notice of foreclosure." I sat on the floor, phone in hand, unable to breathe. Default. Foreclosure. It was happening. Everything was unraveling, and I was watching it like a movie I didn't audition for. That night, Tobias didn't come home. He didn't text, didn't call. And for the first time since I'd met him, I didn't care where he was. I cared that he had broken me. That he had taken the life we built and torched it to the ground for a deal that didn't even exist. He came back 2 days later, hungover and distant. I was sitting in the living room with a packed suitcase beside me, not because I planned to leave, but because I wasn't sure I'd have a choice. He looked at the suitcase and scoffed. "You're not seriously thinking of leaving." I stood up. "I'm thinking about survival, something you clearly don't care about anymore." He dropped onto the couch, sighing like the victim. "It's not as bad as you think. The bank is foreclosing on the house." He shrugged. "They won't follow through. I've spoken to Mercier. He's giving me more time." I looked at him, and what I saw wasn't the man I married. It was a hollow, desperate shell, filled with arrogance, lies, and denial. "You used my name," I whispered. "You used me like a pawn. You're being dramatic." I laughed. I actually laughed loud and bitter. "You're not even sorry, are you?" He didn't answer. And that's when I knew. This man, this stranger in my home, had already made peace with the idea of losing it all, as long as it meant he didn't look weak. But I was done playing the fool. Something inside me snapped, not in a destructive way, in a focused, deliberate, fiery way. I wasn't going to let him bury me under his lies. I wasn't going to walk away empty-handed while he played victim to his own mess. I wasn't going to be a statistic, another woman whose husband ruined her life and got away with it. No. I was going to fight. The day after Tobias told me to pack up, I sat in our kitchen with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. The sun was out, birds chirping, the lavender bush swaying in the wind. It looked like peace. It felt like war. I kept replaying his words. You should start packing. The house isn't technically yours. He said it like he was explaining the weather, like foreclosure was just a blip. But it wasn't a blip. It was a betrayal on a level I never thought possible. I looked around the kitchen I designed, from the hand-tiled backsplash to the open wooden shelves Tobias once said made the house look straight out of a design magazine. I had built this. Every drawer, every light fixture, every cozy corner. This was my sanctuary. And now it was being weaponized against me. But grief was a luxury I could no longer afford. I had a house to save, a marriage to escape, and a future to rebuild. I couldn't wait for a miracle, I had to become one. So I picked up the phone and called the one person I knew who could help. Janine Porter, my cousin, my oldest childhood ally, and more importantly, a shark of a real estate and family attorney. She picked up on the second ring. Amara, you okay? No, I said flatly. I need a lawyer. I met Janine at her downtown office that afternoon. Her hair was in a tight bun, glasses perched on her nose, sharp blazer and sharper stare. I want the whole story, she said. Start from the top. So I told her everything. The forged refinance documents, the voicemail from the bank, the fake signature, the mysterious VM Holdings account, and the call I overheard late at night. She didn't interrupt once, just scribbled notes and nodded slowly. When I finished, she leaned back and said, "He's toast." I need to know what my rights are, I said, voice shaking. Can I save the house? Can I prove the documents were forged? If you didn't sign that refinance agreement, it's fraudulent. A forged signature invalidates the contract, and depending on how deep this goes, it could be criminal fraud, state and federal. What do I need? Evidence, she said. Cold, hard, dated, and not just your word against his. You need documentation, messages, recordings, anything that ties him directly to the act of forgery and misrepresentation. A small fire lit in my chest. I can do that. And that was the beginning of the plan. I returned home that night with a different energy, not sadness, not fear, but clarity. I no longer saw Tobias as my husband. He was now a case to be built, a danger to be neutralized. He walked into the kitchen, smiled as if nothing had happened, and asked what I wanted for dinner. Whatever you want, I said softly, smiling back. Because I had to play the game. If he suspected I was building a case, he'd cover his tracks. He'd vanish, maybe even become dangerous. So I became the perfect wife, or at least the illusion of one. I cooked dinner. I asked about his day. I pretended not to notice the texts he quickly deleted or the whispered calls taken outside. All the while, I was gathering evidence. Over the next 3 weeks, I assembled a digital vault. I backed up the forged refinance documents and made copies, including photos of the physical pages. I installed a recording app on my phone and captured multiple conversations where Tobias referenced the Mercier deal, keeping things quiet, and even a slip where he said, "They'll never know you didn't sign it." I accessed our shared iCloud and found a screenshot he had sent to a friend, a text message that read, "She doesn't know a thing. Signed it for her. If it works, we're out of debt. If not, she'll be the one dealing with it." He said if not, she'll be the one dealing with it. He knew exactly what he was doing. I compiled bank records, showing the savings withdrawals, deposits to the VM Holdings account, and credit card statements where Tobias had made lavish purchases while claiming to be broke. Every time I found something new, I forwarded it to Janine. By the second week, she called me and said, "You've got him by the throat." And still, he had no idea. Quietly, I also began rebuilding my professional life. I reached out to previous clients, letting them know I was taking private work again. I reopened my design blog, shared sketches and mock-ups, and even launched a small digital course on color theory. Money started trickling in, not a flood, but enough to give me hope. I opened a separate bank account in my name only. Tobias didn't know. He never asked. He was too busy drowning in his own delusions. I was no longer surviving. I was preparing to strike. Everything changed, again, when I received a large envelope in the mail with unfamiliar handwriting on the front. Tobias was suing me for divorce. At first, I just stared at the papers, unable to process the irony. Then I saw the listed cause, abandonment and emotional cruelty. I laughed out loud. The man who had secretly mortgaged our home, drained our savings, and forged my signature was now trying to play the victim. But what really sent me spiraling was the list of witnesses attached to his case. And at the top, Patricia Davis, his mother. She had submitted a sworn affidavit accusing me of verbally emasculating her son, controlling all aspects of the marriage, emotionally neglecting him while prioritizing her career, and my favorite, encouraging financial independence that made Tobias feel irrelevant as a man. It was like reading a fictional character loosely based on me, twisted, insulting, but also exactly what I needed. Because Patricia's letter, filled with venom and arrogance, confirmed Tobias's desperation. He was losing control and scrambling to paint me as the villain. Janine and I went into full gear. She filed a motion to challenge the divorce petition based on fraud and financial abuse. We submitted the evidence vault, and Janine drafted a blistering counterstatement outlining every deceit Tobias had committed, including the forged signature, the illegal use of marital property, and the false narrative being presented in court. Then came the day of the preliminary hearing. The courtroom was small, oak panels, buzzing fluorescent lights, and a single judge presiding over a calendar of messy lives. Tobias showed up in a perfectly tailored suit, looking every bit the wounded man. His mother sat beside him, pearls tight around her neck, eyes sharp. I walked in with Janine. My heart was pounding, my palms were sweating, but I stood tall. The judge, a steely woman with gray hair and a no-nonsense air, listened carefully as Janine presented our case. Then, calmly, she began reading aloud from our evidence. The texts, the bank records, the voice recordings, and finally, the quote that turned everything. She doesn't know a thing, signed it for her. If it works, we're out of debt. If not, she'll be the one dealing with it. The courtroom went still. Tobias's face drained of color. His lawyer fumbled with papers. Patricia gasped quietly and turned to look at her son. The judge looked at Tobias, then me. Mrs. DuPont Davis, she said, you've endured a staggering level of deception. This court recognizes not only the presence of fraud, but the abuse of power within a marriage. She looked at Tobias. And Mr. Davis, you will be lucky to walk away from this with your freedom. In that moment, the balance of power, the one he had manipulated and abused, shifted back to me. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I simply breathed. For the first time in months, I exhaled freely. The day the judge issued her ruling. The sky outside was the same slate gray as the suit Tobias wore to court, the one that probably cost more than our last 3 mortgage payments combined. We sat on opposite sides of the courtroom, the air thick with tension and a chill I couldn't shake. He still looked calm, as if this would blow over, as if his charm could bend the law. But I'd learned that his confidence wasn't rooted in truth. It was a mask stitched from manipulation and privilege, and it was finally cracking. Janine stood beside me as the judge cleared her throat and began reading the verdict. In the matter of DuPont Davis v. Davis, this court finds that Mr. Tobias Davis engaged in deliberate financial fraud, including the forging of legal documents, the illegal transfer of marital assets, and the falsification of consent in a contractual agreement. Each word landed like a drumbeat. Boom, boom, boom. The refinancing agreement is hereby declared void. Full ownership of the property at 42 Evergreen Lane is to be transferred into the sole name of Amara DuPont Davis. I closed my eyes. Not to cry, there were no tears left, just the deep, satisfying calm of vindication. Furthermore, the court will issue a separate order for the review of criminal charges for forgery and fraud. Restitution is to be determined in a separate hearing. Tobias finally flinched. His mother, who had been sitting behind him with that same steel gaze she'd worn since I met her, let out a sound, a faint gasp, like she'd just realized the damage her golden boy had done wasn't going to vanish under her social polish. Tobias looked at me then, not with anger, with fear, real fear. And in that moment, I realized that he had never expected me to win. Outside the courthouse, Janine hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "You did it," she said into my ear. "You fought back." "No," I whispered. "We did." She stepped back, smiling. "You were the one in that house, Amara. You were the one who stayed long enough to gather everything. You played the long game, and now you own the house, free and clear." I turned to look up at the sky. The clouds were clearing. I thought of all the nights I cried in our bedroom while Tobias blamed me for his stress. The nights I convinced myself I was overthinking it. The days I spent pretending I didn't know what I knew. The hours I spent quietly building a case, recording, documenting, surviving. And now I had a home, a business plan, a future, and myself. Tobias. He had court-mandated restitution, a disgraced career, and a fraud investigation that wasn't going away. And that, I thought, was the poetic justice he never saw coming. The first thing I did when I got the deed to the house in my name, I changed the locks. Not because Tobias would come back, he legally couldn't, but because I needed to mark the end of his presence. The old locks held fingerprints I didn't want to carry anymore. Then I opened all the windows, played Nina Simone on full blast, and danced barefoot through the halls. Poppy barked and spun in circles, feeding off my energy. We were free. But I wasn't content to simply own the house. I needed to transform it. Every corner, every wall, every piece of trim held memories, both beautiful and tainted. I needed to strip it down, gut it, give it a second chance, just like I was giving myself. I started with the master bedroom. I ripped up the carpet Tobias had insisted on. Beneath it, hardwood floors waited patiently, hidden under years of compromise. Next came the kitchen. I painted the cabinets sage green, replaced the industrial hardware with something softer, brass and brushed gold. I installed open shelves for my teacups and antique bowls. But the biggest change came in the garage. What had once been Tobias's man cave, a space filled with unused weights, cigar boxes, and beer memorabilia, became the beating heart of my new vision. The Fresh Start studio. I laid laminate flooring, hung mood boards, installed shelves for samples and fabrics, created a cozy corner for client consultations. I painted the back wall with a mural, a rising sun over abstract waves, and etched into the trim a phrase that had become my mantra. Rebuild, redesign, rise. It didn't take long before the inquiries started rolling in. Women I had met during the case, neighbors who had heard what happened, former clients who reached out with a "I heard you're back, do you still take private projects?" I didn't just say yes. I said hell yes. Within 2 months, I had 5 regular clients, 2 design apprentices shadowing me, and a wait list for consultations. But it wasn't just the business that made my heart swell. It was who I was becoming. I was no longer the woman who needed a husband to feel secure. I was no longer trying to keep peace at the expense of my truth. I was building something entirely my own, brick by brick, choice by choice. One afternoon, while sipping coffee on the porch, I received an email from a woman I didn't recognize. Subject line: "Saw your interview on the local podcast. I need help." She explained that she had gone through something similar. Her husband had taken out loans in her name, ruined her credit, and then disappeared. She didn't know where to start. I invited her for tea. That one conversation turned into a second. And then a third woman reached out. And soon, every Friday, I was hosting small, quiet gatherings in my studio, a support circle for women rebuilding after betrayal. We cried. We laughed. We made vision boards and drank rosé and shared financial advice. We rose together. It was mid-autumn, 6 months after the ruling, when Tobias showed up at my door. The air was crisp. Leaves had gathered along the driveway. I had just come in from planting mums near the walkway. I didn't recognize the car at first, a dented sedan, nothing like the sleek Lexus he used to polish every Sunday morning. When I saw his figure step out, my stomach turned, but I held my ground. He looked smaller, paler. His suit was wrinkled and his eyes were sunken. He didn't knock, just stood there. I opened the door only halfway. "Amara," he said, voice barely audible. I said nothing. I messed up, he said. I know I lost everything. Still, I stayed silent. I thought I was fixing things, I thought I could control it, but I ruined it, I ruined us. He looked at me like I was still his wife. Like somehow, the right words might undo the wreckage. I wanted to say sorry. It didn't feel satisfying the way I thought it might. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cruel. I felt done. "You taught me what destruction looks like," I said softly. He blinked. I stepped back and added, "But I chose to rebuild." Then I closed the door. Not with anger. With peace. After Tobias left my porch that day, there was no cinematic release. No falling to the floor in a flood of tears. No wave of satisfaction. It was just quiet. And that's when I realized that kind of quiet was what freedom sounded like. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to someone else's decisions. I wasn't questioning my sanity, doubting my instincts, or shrinking myself to avoid conflict. I was whole, and no one had given it to me. I'd reclaimed it. There's a myth that women are strong by default. We are praised for surviving, for enduring, for holding it all together. But real strength, I learned, doesn't just come from enduring pain. It comes from choosing to rise after it. And that was what I was doing. The more I spent time in the Fresh Start studio, the more I realized it wasn't just a workspace. It was an altar to my healing. Every design consultation, every mood board I created, every paint swatch I laid out for a client felt like an act of reclamation. I wasn't just helping women pick furniture. I was helping them design new lives. Lives that no longer included begging for love. Lives that weren't built on borrowed security or forged promises. One of my clients, a school counselor named Tasha, came to me after leaving a 10-year marriage that had drained her emotionally and financially. She sat across from me during our first session and said, "I don't even know what I like anymore. I haven't made a decision for myself in a decade." I gave her a soft smile. "Then let's start small. What colors make you feel safe?" She paused. Green, not lime, not forest, something in between. We spent 2 months redesigning her space. Green velvet chairs, warm wood floors, light filtering curtains. When we finished, she cried. "It feels like me, or at least like the me I want to become." I hugged her, heart full. That became the mission of the studio, not just to decorate homes, but to help rebuild women's sense of self. Word started to spread. I wasn't advertising in the traditional sense. My clients were my advocates, my voice in the wind. Each woman I worked with told another. And soon, I wasn't just a designer. I was a speaker, a quiet revolution builder. By spring, the studio was hosting regular workshops. Designing through divorce. Color psychology and emotional safety. Reclaiming space, boundaries at home. I even hosted my first retreat weekend, a 2-day event for women navigating betrayal, breakups, and major life transitions. We painted, meditated, redesigned personal spaces, and shared stories over firelight. That weekend changed me. Because for the first time, I stood in front of a room full of women, some crying, some laughing, all of them powerful, and said out loud, "You are not what they did to you. You are what you do with it." The applause that followed wasn't just for me. It was for every woman in that room who had once felt like her world was ending and was now building a new one. One morning, I woke up and realized I hadn't thought about Tobias in weeks. Not because I hated him, that part had passed long ago, but because he simply no longer existed in the life I was living. And that realization was sweeter than any courtroom victory. I'd stopped checking his socials. He had gone offline after the fraud charges were filed. I didn't ask mutual friends about him. I didn't care who he was dating, where he was working, or what pity stories he was spinning. He was irrelevant. What mattered now were the women walking through the doors of Fresh Start Studio, some confident, others shaking, all of them holding some version of a shattered dream in their hands and asking, "Can you help me start again?" And I always answered, "Yes, absolutely yes." But even in my healing, I faced challenges. One client, Delilah, a high-profile divorcee and single mother of twins, had a complete breakdown during a consultation. We were sitting on the floor, sorting through fabric swatches when she said, "You make this look easy, like you just moved on." I paused. I didn't move on, I moved through. She looked up. "But aren't you afraid it'll happen again? Falling for someone, trusting them, giving them everything, only to have them take it?" That stopped me. I hadn't dated since Tobias, hadn't flirted, hadn't opened myself up to the idea of romantic vulnerability. "I'm not afraid of trusting again," I said slowly. "Because this time, I trust myself more than I ever trusted anyone else. I trust that I'll see the red flags. I'll listen to my gut. And if someone tries to break me again, I'll know how to put myself back together." She smiled. "That's brave." "No," I said, "that's healing." That night after Delilah left, I sat in the studio alone with a glass of wine and scrolled through the before pictures of my home, the original photos I'd taken back when Tobias and I moved in. The furniture, the walls, the smiles. I didn't delete them. I didn't need to. They weren't shameful. They were evidence of growth. I had once loved that man. And now I love the woman who survived him. There's a strange stillness that comes after a long battle, not silence exactly, but a quietness in your soul. A place where grief used to scream and shame used to whisper is now filled with breath. That's where I lived now. It didn't mean everything was perfect. I still had mornings when I woke up tense, expecting something to go wrong. I still flinched when I opened official mail, worried about some unpaid fee Tobias had forgotten. I still caught myself checking the locks twice before bed. But more and more, those habits were being replaced by rituals of peace. I burned sage every Sunday. I bought myself fresh flowers on Fridays. I relearned the joy of cooking for one lemon garlic salmon, homemade lavender syrup, chocolate chip cookies with sea salt. I started journaling again, not to survive the chaos, but to savor the calm. And slowly, space opened up. Space to think, to dream, to feel things I hadn't let myself feel in years. It started one afternoon, the local bookstore. I was browsing a shelf of design theory books when I dropped one, a thick hardcover with a broken spine. Before I could bend down, a hand reached out and picked it up. "That's a good one," said a deep, warm voice. I looked up. The man holding the book had kind eyes, dark skin, and a quiet smile that didn't try too hard. He wore a dark gray sweater, jeans, and a leather messenger bag slung across his chest. "Thanks," I said, offering a polite smile. He handed it to me. "I'm Elijah." "Amara. You're a designer." I nodded. "Interior." "I'm a set designer," he said. "TV and film, mostly indie stuff." We ended up talking in that aisle for nearly 40 minutes, about color theory, about the rise of warm neutrals, about how light affects emotion. It was so easy, I forgot to be guarded. When we parted, he said, "If you ever want to grab coffee and talk about ugly wallpaper trends, I'm around." I laughed. That sounds like a strange and strangely perfect date. He smiled. Exactly what I was thinking. I didn't call him for 2 weeks. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid of becoming small again. Of giving too much. Of not seeing the signs. But then I remembered what I told Delilah. I trust myself now. So I texted him, still up for that coffee. He replied instantly, named the time and place. We met on a rainy Tuesday at a tiny coffee shop with Edison bulbs and chipped mugs. I wore a navy trench coat and minimal makeup. He brought me a rose made from recycled paper, handcrafted by his niece. I figured it wouldn't wilt, he said. We talked for hours. About everything. Our work, our families, our failures, our fears. He didn't push. He didn't ask questions that tried to probe open wounds. He just listened, and when I spoke about the divorce, the real, raw parts, he didn't flinch. That man lost something he never deserved, Elijah said quietly. And for the first time in a long time, I believed that. We didn't rush into anything. We moved slow. Intentionally. Dinner once a week, walks on Sundays, texts that didn't demand attention but offered connection. He never once made me feel like I needed to be smaller for him to feel big. And that, more than anything, made me curious about what we could become. 1 year after the court ruled in my favor, I stood on the front lawn of my house, alone. Not lonely. Just alone. I was holding a small champagne bottle in one hand and a set of blueprints in the other. Fresh Start Studio had outgrown the garage. I just signed a lease on a nearby commercial space, double the size, with big windows and high ceilings. But I had kept the house. My home. And not just physically. Emotionally, spiritually, personally. Tobias had once used it as collateral. I had turned it into sanctuary. The flowers I planted bloomed brighter. The porch swing no longer creaked under guilt. The walls inside didn't whisper anymore, they celebrated. I walked through each room, touching the edges of the furniture, the walls, the light fixtures I chose. They weren't reminders of the past anymore. They were declarations of the future. I paused in the living room, where sunlight poured through the large front window. And I whispered to the woman I used to be. You did it. You didn't just survive, you rose. Later that evening, I hosted a dinner with a few close friends, Liana, Janine, Tasha, Delilah, and even my accountant, who had become a sort of accidental therapist during the financial recovery process. We laughed over pasta and wine. We shared horror stories and hope. We talked about the lives we were building and the women we were becoming. When the last dish was cleared, Liana raised a toast. To Amara, she said, glass high, for fighting like hell and then turning hell into a home. I raised my own glass, heart full. To all of us, I said, for refusing to stay buried under what broke us, for turning betrayal into blueprints, for rebuilding room by room. Glasses clinked. And just like that, I knew. This wasn't just my home anymore. It was a beacon. A place where stories could end and begin again. The day I opened the doors to the new Fresh Start Studio, I wore white. Not because I was trying to symbolize purity or rebirth, but because I felt radiant. And white, in its quiet power, reflected every color that touched it. The space had taken months to design. I chose everything intentionally, from the rounded arches that softened each room to the warm recessed lighting that made even gray days feel golden. The floors were reclaimed maple. The walls were lined with framed photos of my early projects, and in the center of the front lobby was a sign that read, "This is not just design, this is deliverance." The ribbon-cutting ceremony wasn't flashy. I didn't want big speeches or press coverage. I wanted presence, real connection. So I invited the women who had walked with me through my darkest chapters, my support group, my client Stern sisters, the team I'd built from the ground up. Elijah was there too, standing in the back with a quiet smile, holding a bouquet of blue hydrangeas, my favorite. As I stepped up to the front door, giant scissors in hand, I felt a wave of emotion rise in my chest. Not sadness. Not even pride. just wholeness. I looked at the women gathered, the space I'd poured my soul into, and I said, "This studio is for every woman who was told to sit still, be quiet, stay small, and carry pain she never caused. For every woman who lost her home, in bricks or in body, and chose to rebuild anyway." Then I cut the ribbon, and with it, severed the last tie to the version of myself that ever doubted her own power. I didn't mean to go public with my story. I was content running the studio, teaching workshops, mentoring women who were reclaiming their voices and their space. But one afternoon, a local journalist reached out after attending one of my design seminars. She'd heard whispers about my journey and wanted to interview me for a piece titled "Healing Through Space." I was hesitant. Vulnerability was something I practiced in private, in small, safe rooms. But she said something that stuck with me. "Your story might be the mirror someone else needs to finally see themselves clearly." So I agreed. We met over coffee and talked for 2 hours. I told her everything, not just the facts, but the feelings, the denial, the panic. The moment I realized the house I was fighting for wasn't just physical, it was me. The article went viral. Not in a celebrity scandal way, but in a ripple effect kind of way. Emails started pouring in. Women from around the country, some even from overseas, wrote to say thank you. I didn't know I was allowed to leave. I thought it was just me. Reading your story was like looking in a mirror. I cried reading each one, not because of the pain, but because of the community that was forming around it. I wasn't alone, and neither were they. Soon, Fresh Start Studio expanded again, this time digitally. I launched a podcast, Blueprints and Boundaries. I co-authored a guidebook, Rebuilding After Betrayal, Designing a Life You Own. I spoke at women's conferences, shelters, retreats, not just about interior design, but about interior work, about rebuilding from the inside out. And everywhere I went, I said the same thing. You are not broken. You are under renovation. 1 year later, I stood on the balcony of my home, the one Tobias once tried to steal. The city below was still waking up. Golden light spilled over the rooftops, birds stretched their wings, and Poppy rested at my feet, tail wagging slowly. Inside, the studio was quiet. The furniture was covered for the weekend. The coffee was brewing. And I felt still. Not stuck still. Peaceful. At ease. And when Elijah came out behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, I leaned into him without hesitation. "I'm proud of you," he whispered. I smiled. "I'm proud of me too." He rested his chin on my shoulder. "What would you say to the you from 2 years ago, the one standing in the ruins, thinking it was all over?" I thought about it for a long moment. Then I said, "I'd tell her that betrayal is the end of the story. It's the start of the truth." And as the sun lifted higher over the city, casting everything in gold, I whispered the final words that would become the new chapter of my life. I fought back. I won. And I finally came home. To myself.